Boston's Government Center is the civic heart of the city at the nexus of Beacon Hill and the West End. This space is dominated by two of the city's largest governmental buildings, Boston City Hall and the John F. Kennedy Federal Building, as well as the red brick paved Boston City Hall Plaza. This large area was designed by the renowned architect I.M. Pei and constructed between 1961 and 1968. 75 years ago, however, this iconic part of the city would have been completely unrecognizable. In truth, the public discourse around Government Center is dominated by only one of its buildings, Boston City Hall. Boston City Hall is widely hailed as a triumph of brutalist architecture, and it stands as a monument to the city's civic government. Boston City Hall was designed in 1961 by the then unknown architectural firm Coleman, McKinnell & Knowles, who won the contract for the building with their submission to a design contest held by the city for the proposed new City Hall. Upon its completion in 1968, their design for Boston City Hall was immediately lauded as a paragon of monumental brutalist architecture, although the praise was not ubiquitous. Debate on its aesthetic quality is still a hot button issue for some Bostonians. Here we see the world-renowned architect I.M. Pei, designer of Government Center, and Gerard Coleman and Michael McKinnell, co-designers of Boston City Hall. Despite the world-famous architects involved with its design, the commemorative plaque on the outside of the building dedicates its memory to one man, the Boston mayor who initiated the urban renewal project to build Government Center in partnership with the Boston Redevelopment Authority, now the Boston Planning and Development Agency, Mayor John Collins. Many Bostonians are aware, even if vaguely, that the site of Government Center that we know today was once the subject of a massive urban renewal program that redeveloped Scollay Square. Scollay Square was a historic neighborhood in the heart of Boston. During the mid-19th century and up through World War II, Scollay Square was a lively entertainment district where many of the theaters and bars catered to the city's thirst for the nightlife. During World War II especially, this area catered to the sailors and servicemen stationed at Boston's Navy Yard with a number of burlesque theaters. The most iconic of these was the Old Howard Theater, or Howard Athenaeum, which began its life as a church in the 1840s and then was later converted into a theater. Old Howard Theater became a symbol for the lively entertainment that the district had to offer. The story of urban renewal in Scollay Square echoes that of many districts targeted for urban renewal in the mid-20th century. After World War II and the departure of the sailors stationed at the Boston Navy Yard, Scollay Square's entertainment industry lost its greatest source of revenue and began to dwindle. Some of the theaters and bars turned to more risque forms of entertainment, putting them ever at odds with the Boston Board of Censors. The Boston Board of Censors ultimately closed the Old Howard Theater in 1953, and it never reopened. The once lively district that was bustling with nightlife had fallen on hard times. Nevertheless, through the 1950s, it still served as a hub of nightlife and even catered to the LGBT community. As was the case with many other urban renewal programs, Scollay Square's economic downturn and sexually explicit entertainment industry were taken as signs of moral decay, and calls began for the redevelopment of the area. These calls to redevelop the area followed a familiar pattern, with the generative metaphor of immorality being associated with blight, decay, and sickness, thereby justifying the destruction of Scollay Square as if it were some sort of infection poised to take over the city. In close partnership with Mayor John Collins, the Boston Redevelopment Authority began purchasing properties within Scollay Square in 1961 under the authority granted by Title I of the Federal Housing Act of 1949, and by the early acquisition process enabled by the Federal Highway Act of 1956. That same year, the old Howard Theater burned down. The demolition of Scollay Square's buildings began the next year in 1962. Charles Miller's review of the newly constructed Government Center in the Hudson Review in 1970 provides insight into how the Scollay Square area was viewed before its redevelopment, and how I.M. Pei himself recommended the wholesale demolition of the once vibrant neighborhood. In the end, the new Government Center was hailed as a model of successful urban renewal. While many Bostonians are vaguely aware of the story of the redevelopment of Scollay Square for Government Center, few recognize that the urban renewal of Scollay Square was actually part of a much larger effort to redevelop the entire West End that began in the decade prior. The redevelopment of Government Center on the site of the former Scollay Square was simply the crown jewel of a much larger urban renewal effort that displaced thousands of people from the late 1950s to the early 1960s from Boston's West End. It began under Boston Mayor John Hines, who served from 1950 to 1960. Using the authority granted by Title I of the Federal Housing Act of 1949, the Boston Redevelopment Agency began the wholesale clearing of Boston's West End, again justified by the generative metaphor of blight and moral decay. Ultimately, for the residents of the West End, there was little opportunity to voice their concern over the loss of their homes, which the Boston Redevelopment Authority had deemed slums fit for clearance. Armed with funding from the BRA, and in partnership with the Boston Mayor John Hines, they purchased buildings across the West End and forced residents to relocate. The demolition of Scollay Square in 1962 under then-Mayor John Collins was the culmination of a larger destructive urban renewal program that began under the previous Mayor John Hines. These aerial images outline the area of Government Center in red. On the left, you see an aerial image taken in 1955 showing the future location of Government Center over what was then Scollay Square. Note the dense West End neighborhood in the upper left of the image. On the right, you see the same view of the city in 1969, showing the newly constructed Government Center and a large empty swath of the West End demolished in the upper left of the image. In total, around 7,500 residents were displaced from Boston's West End neighborhood. The working class residents, many of African American, Italian, or Jewish backgrounds, were uprooted from their lives and forcibly relocated by the policies of the city of Boston. This story is an ugly counter to the narrative of the story of the plucky, then unknown architects Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles and their creation of a brutalist wonder on Boston City Hall Plaza. And it flies in the face of Boston City Hall's function as a monument to civic government where citizens can feel empowered to engage with their elected officials. Few Bostonians remember the West End as it was before urban renewal, but those that do take pride in their identity as West Enders. The West End Museum had taken on the project of sharing this lost neighborhood's history and connecting those who share in that identity. They have hosted exhibits and lecture series on the West End history, as well as offered guided tours through the remade West End. Unfortunately, in January of this year, the West End Museum was afflicted by massive flooding and forced to close. They continue to try to raise funds for the repairs and renovations they need to reopen, but for now, Boston's greatest advocate for the counter-narrative to Government Center's development has shuttered its doors. Currently, Boston City Hall Plaza is in the midst of yet another redesign. The Boston Planning and Development Agency, heir to the BRA, is planning on remaking the area from an empty expanse of red brick to one that features tree-shaded seating areas, a play space, public art, and a new public event space. Noticeably absent from their plan is a commemorative plaque dedicated to the West End and Scollay Square. The task of commemorating the neighborhoods lost to the destructive urban renewal policies of the mid-20th century should not fall to a small local museum alone. The city has a responsibility to acknowledge the pain caused by the destructive policies of the past. Other areas of the city have acknowledged painful aspects of their history through public interpretive panels and public art. Boston Harbor's memorial to the Atlantic slave trade is just one example. The Southwest Corridor Park also acknowledges its history related to the use of eminent domain to clear a swath through Jamaica Plain and Roxbury for Highway I-95, which was never built. And Faneuil Hall acknowledges Peter Faneuil's ties to the slave trade by means of an interpretive panel. At Boston City Hall and Government Center, an acknowledgement of the pain caused by urban renewal is glaringly lacking. The city should partner with the West End Museum, which is still functioning online even without the use of their facilities, and any city residents with living memories of Scollay Square and the West End before urban renewal to design a public informational panel or art piece that acknowledges this history. While the city can never undo what was done to the West End, an acknowledgement would at least form the basis of accountability and the city's commitment to do right by its residents going forward.